Most men are taught something that sounds right on paper but collapses in real life. They're told that showing up consistently, communicating clearly, and being emotionally available is how attraction is built. And yet, over and over again, reality tells a different story. You see, women become deeply attached to men who give them very little. Men who don't text often. Men who disappear for days, sometimes weeks, then return like nothing happened. Men who offer fragments instead of commitment. And somehow, those men occupy more space in her mind than the ones who were always present. This isn't because those men are better, kinder, or more valuable. It's because attraction doesn't grow from frequency. It grows from contrast. When a man is always available, always explaining himself, always checking in, his presence becomes emotionally flat, predictable, safe, yes, but also uncharged. The man who shows up rarely doesn't give her enough information to get bored or fully relax. And because the human mind hates empty space, it fills the gaps on its own. She imagines, she projects, she builds a version of him that doesn't actually exist. That imagined version becomes more powerful than any fully present man ever could be. Not because it's real, but because it's unfinished. Infrequent attention creates emotional spikes. Presence followed by absence. Warmth followed by silence. And the nervous system doesn't interpret that as love. It interprets it as anticipation mixed with uncertainty. That combination is addictive when someone hasn't learned emotional regulation. Every message feels heavier. Every moment together feels intense because it's rare. Instead of evaluating the man logically, his effort, reliability, or character, she evaluates him emotionally, based on how she feels when he's there. And because those moments are limited, the feelings hit harder and linger longer than they should. This is where many men misunderstand what's happening and start blaming themselves. They assume they weren't good enough, attentive enough, or interesting enough. But that's not the real dynamic. She isn't choosing character. She's choosing sensation. She's choosing the emotional charge that comes from unpredictability. The man who gives little isn't winning because he's superior. He's winning because he's undefined. And the undefined always feels more exciting than the known. Regular communication creates emotional stability, but stability doesn't always feel exciting to someone who associates love with intensity. If someone's nervous system is wired to chaos, calm can feel empty. Consistency can feel like a loss of momentum. The man who shows up rarely keeps the nervous system activated, waiting, wondering, replaying conversations. That internal loop keeps him emotionally relevant even when he's physically absent. This is why trying harder often backfires. The more a man explains himself, reassures, or seeks clarity, the more he collapses the mystery. Once mystery disappears, the emotional charge fades. Not because he did something wrong, but because he became real. Reality doesn't compete well with fantasy. When someone prefers emotional highs over emotional truth, what often goes unsaid is that they're not attached to the man himself. They're attached to the emotional roller coaster. This doesn't mean disappearing is power. That's insecurity disguised as strategy. The real lesson isn't to talk less so someone wants you more. The lesson is that over-availability kills polarity. When your emotional world revolves around another person, you lose your center. And when you lose your center, you lose the very thing that made you attractive to begin with: independence, direction, self-containment. Men who naturally fall into this pattern aren't trying to be distant. They're busy. Their lives don't orbit around validation. They don't need constant connection to feel whole. And that's what creates attraction, even if it's not consciously understood. It's not silence that creates desire. It's emotional self-sufficiency. Many men sabotage themselves by trying to secure attraction instead of allowing it to breathe. They text to confirm interest, talk to reduce anxiety, explain to prevent loss. But attraction doesn't grow in reassurance. It grows in space. A man who doesn't need constant engagement isn't withholding. He's simply not negotiating his worth through attention. When communication is scarce, the mind fills in the blanks. And the mind is far more creative than reality. Silence becomes meaningful. Absence becomes symbolic. Not because someone is irrational, but because empty space demands interpretation. The man who is always talking leaves nothing to imagine. The man who leaves space creates a canvas. An unchecked imagination becomes attached. This is why some women stay emotionally tied to men who give very little. Every small sign of attention feels earned. Every moment together feels rare. And rarity creates perceived value, even when logic says it shouldn't. She isn't attached to the man. She's attached to the emotional fluctuation he provides. Men often assume women want closeness because they ask for it, but what they often want is stimulation, not saturation. Too much access removes tension. Too much talking removes polarity. And without polarity, desire fades quietly, not in drama, but in indifference. The man who engages without chasing preserves tension, not through games, but through groundedness. Silence alone isn't strength. Silence backed by a full life, clear direction, and self-respect carries weight. It communicates abundance without words. It says, "My life continues whether you're here or not." That signal hits deeper than reassurance ever could. At the core, this dynamic isn't about talking less. It's about needing less. Less validation, less reassurance, less control. When a man builds a life that doesn't hinge on being chosen, his absence stops feeling like neglect and starts feeling like gravity. And gravity doesn't chase, it pulls. Attraction responds to emotional posture, not emotional volume. The man who is constantly checking in is subconsciously asking for permission to matter. The man who remains steady, even in uncertainty, signals self-trust, and self-trust reshapes the entire dynamic. This is why women often feel pulled toward men who seem emotionally untouched by the relationship. Not because those men are heartless, but because they haven't handed over control of their emotional state. Their mood doesn't rise and fall with response times. Their self-worth doesn't depend on attention. That emotional independence reads as strength. The uncomfortable truth for most men is this: confidence doesn't come from knowing you won't be abandoned. It comes from knowing you'll be fine if you are. The man who has made peace with that doesn't scramble when energy shifts. He stays exactly where he is. And that steadiness, especially in uncertainty, is deeply attractive. The goal was never distance. The goal was alignment. When a man stops organizing his emotions around someone else's availability, attraction recalibrates naturally, not as a tactic, but as a consequence. And when attraction stops being the goal, it often shows up on its own. In the end, women aren't drawn to men who barely talk. They're drawn to men who don't lose themselves trying to be wanted. Men who can connect without clinging. Men who can walk away without resentment. That isn't detachment, that's strength. And strength, even in silence, is unforgettable.